All right, hi there, everybody. So I recorded yesterday's video. I was so tired I yawned twice in it. But there is great content over on Hoeg Law, and I brought him on the show today to talk about your videos instead of talking about your videos. So you have just some great content about the Activision merger, about the Bungie merger, and I hit you up on Twitter. I was like, hey, do you just want to come on? Because there is so much to read into this that I think I just need to get an expert. So thank you for joining me.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I try to be responsive to those DMs. It was fantastic. I'm always happy to answer questions and give info if I can. So if I can be helpful, great.
Great. Well, some of the questions I sort of have, and I'm seeing a lot of this online. I saw, like you pointed out, that the DOJ and FTC, it's normal practice for them to be involved. And that was like something I didn't know, because you read the headlines and you're kind of like, oh, the FTC's getting involved. This is really serious. Like they're really looking at it. And like for you, you're like, this happens all the time, right?
Yeah, that's the standard protocol, right? You can even go on the FTC's website right now. But in essence, in the United States, there's a law that says if your deal gets over a certain size, you're going to submit your paperwork. You're going to tell us what this transaction is. And the us in that sentence is the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. They both have joint authority over reviewing potential acquisitions / mergers. And then basically, if they're going to have to take a slightly deeper dive than just, oh, yes, that $3 million transaction is fine, and keep them running because they're otherwise looking at all these acquisitions, then you're going to have to decide which agency is going to look at it because they have limited resources. They don't want to cover the same ground twice. And so it'll be either the FTC or the DOJ. One of the ways they decide on this is essentially who they think has the best institutional knowledge. And certainly that could go either way. Both the Department of Justice and the FTC have looked at big tech, have looked at horizontal mergers, vertical mergers, all these kinds of things. But the FTC most recently has dealt with NVIDIA and ARM, has dealt with Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. And so it wasn't really a surprise that the FTC took the reins on this. So when you see those headlines that say FTC now investigating Microsoft, I think one takeaway is somebody was always going to investigate. That's part of the law. You're always going to look at a deal this big. And then there's a chance for a second look. There's a chance for a deeper dive. And I think that'll happen because of the size and because of some of the saber rattling that's happened in Washington about making sure big technology giants aren't commoditizing various markets. So I think you're going to have that second look. The other aspect of it is, I know one of the subheadings that went around, I talked about this a bit on Virtual Legality, is this is a break from tradition. That's absolutely categorically false. One or the other of these agencies is always looking at these things. And then if it gets bigger from there, it'll be silent for a long time from our perspective. Then you'll know it. The FTC will start talking about a settlement or a potential threat. And while I don't think that's particularly likely in this deal, and that might be another of your questions,
well, yeah,
it can happen. It can happen in this antitrust kind of regulatory environment.
Well, let's cut to the chase. Do you think the Activision Blizzard deal will go through with Microsoft?
Yes, I do. I've said to people, they've asked me percentages. I think we're looking at 80-20, something along those lines. And it really should be higher based on all the reasons people can think of. Microsoft keeps going out there with the repeated statement, we're going to be third in revenue in gaming, right? They've said that, I think, from Phil. They've said it from Satya. They've said it in various places. Expect that to be heard from Microsoft for the next quarter or so.
Because they're pushing that narrative about that aspect of it. And you really insightfully pointed out people aren't looking at the right thing, right?
Right. If they're going to get in trouble with regulators, it's not going to be because Microsoft is monopolizing or curtailing competition in quote unquote gaming, right? People are rightly pointing out there's huge mobile gaming environments. There's all sorts of players and publishers and developers in video gaming. Microsoft says themselves they'll be third in revenue. If they're going to get pressure from regulators, it's going to be looking at the market differently, right? If you think about who's a monopolist, who can actually kill competition, you're thinking about market percentages. It's always that denominator question. What market are we talking about? You saw Satya give that quote a couple of days ago that says, well, it all depends on what market we're talking about. Microsoft continues to argue we're talking about gaming, but the FTC can come in and say, no, we're not talking about gaming. We're talking about subscription gaming. We're talking about cloud infrastructure-based gaming. We're talking about various other things that if they wanted to make trouble for Microsoft, you can frame a market that is probably monopolized or otherwise being affected pretty significantly by this. The one thing we know when you buy Activision is Call of Duty might well appear on the PlayStation. Phil Spencer has hinted at that. There's a lot that goes into that kind of negotiation, but we're pretty positive it won't and can't appear on whatever might be a Game Pass competitor. whatever Spartacus looks like, whatever comes out of that from the Sony side. So if you say the market is Game Passes, whatever they might be called, then purchasing Call of Duty looks like some kind of content exclusivity deal that could harm nascent competition, which is a phrase that you hear from those regulators all the time. Whereas you've got your Facebook that squashes Instagram before it can get too big by buying them. You've got Microsoft that went a different direction where, again, if you want to frame it as a problem, you say, well, they bought out some of the best content for a competing software subscription service, and maybe we should do something about that. I still think that's unlikely. But the reason I say it's 80-20 and not 95-5 is because if you are following what's happening in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of saber rattling. There's a lot of folks invested in saying we're going to use the antitrust legislation that we have arrayed before us to curtail more transactions. We're going to be more aggressive about what we think hurts competition, and in particular, in what they describe as digital markets and big technology. Microsoft doesn't quite fit that. They're really most concerned with Google and Facebook and that kind of thing. But Microsoft is, of course, a technology company that is very, very big and has had run-ins with regulators before. So that environment has to be taken into account.
So with the subscription model, we know, well, Nintendo has their model. They've released some older games. We have PlayStation now. Spartacus is coming. PlayStation Plus is doing some stuff with free games, but that's more comparable to Xbox Live, which sort of got looped in with Game Pass. Do you think Xbox or Microsoft would largely point out those? And then how likely would the FTC be to be like, oh yeah, you're right? Or are they going to be like, oh, it's not the same thing? Like how are they going to look at that categorically?
Well, at a fundamental level, antitrust is very, very vague, right? The laws themselves say you shall not acquire the stock of another company. You won't take over another company if it reduces competition or affects a monopoly. And so that gives the FTC a great deal of leeway to project out what could potentially reduce competition. You go and you look at the federal guidelines for these various things, and you'll see a lot of language that says, hey, this is all prognostication. This is all predictive. And if the FTC determines that something is likely to happen, that they don't need to be certain that it will happen in order to cause trouble. So that makes the enforcement of antitrust kind of inherently political. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but it means that you're going to be delving into the minds of very specific regulators and what they think about things. So when you ask me to predict this, I say historically, we're talking about media, which hasn't usually raised the ire of the FTC. You know, it's Call of Duty. It's not microchips that go into missiles or energy pipelines or things that we're specifically concerned about for national security reasons, for instance. A lot of people point out, you know, the Biden administration had an executive order in the summer last year. I mentioned it in one of my videos that said, hey, we're going to take a deeper dive on antitrust. We're going to protect things. They mentioned the digital markets. But for the most part, they're very concerned about ownership and takeovers and national security, not Call of Duty, generally speaking. However, Microsoft, as the top line of an FTC complaint or a lawsuit, has a certain political attractiveness. We just have to be honest about that. There's a certain amount of
historically, like if you go back to the Bill Gates era, they were accused of monopolization, right?
Public enemy number one, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, they had some of the biggest technology antitrust lawsuits ever made because technology, in terms of the law, is very, very, very young for what we're talking about, modern digital technology. And the law goes very, very slowly. So Microsoft is still one of the biggest instances of this particular fight. And if you actually go and dive into the history there, it didn't end particularly well for really either side. It just kind of simmered away as things kind of finished off. The settlement got kicked out. All sorts of things that aren't pertinent to this question, except to note that Microsoft has a history of dealing with the regulators. Microsoft has cachet. People recognize it. And if you're the FTC, you might get it in your head to say, that would get headlines. That would get coverage. Hey, we're not just rattling our saber. We're doing something about one of the biggest tech companies in the world. And so that's where I leave that 20%, right? I also leave that 20% with other regulators that I'm not as familiar with, right? The EU is often more aggressive with using its antitrust authority. You have EU companies involved in this transaction with the king side of Activision Blizzard. So I still think it's more likely than not to go through. It's media. It's not that critical infrastructure. It really doesn't pose that national security issue. Microsoft is certainly going to brief them on the gaming industry on the whole. Even when I talk about cloud infrastructure and subscription services, that involves a lot of work from the FTC to actually determine what markets they want to establish that as when, let's be frank, they don't really exist right now. people can point to other kinds of quote unquote subscription services, but what Game Pass is doing isn't really replicated as it stands right now. So the argument would be you're trying to kill everything else in the crib before it can compete with you. And that isn't as strong as, hey, we can point to this, we can show you how this price is going to change and move on from there. So I look at it and say it's more likely than not to go through. The other thing I would point out, though, is it doesn't just have to be blocked. It's not all or nothing from the regulators. They can go in and say, you need to promise us this. You need to divest of a certain aspect of the company that you're purchasing. There's all sorts of things that they can say, this is what you're going to have to do for us to allow it in our jurisdiction.
Let's play this out worst case scenario wise. You've kind of said that you think the deal is going to go through. What is worst case for Microsoft, I guess, would be the one that we're analyzing. So like for Microsoft, what would their worst case be? Like, is this going to be drug out for like 10 years and they're just never going to be able to buy the company?
It would be unlikely to be that long.
Yeah, like, I'm exaggerating. Yeah.
Yeah. So Microsoft, one of the reasons you see in their press statement that they only are promising it by the end of fiscal year 23 is that's built in. They didn't have that long of a wait for ZeniMax. That's not traditionally that long of a wait to get closing conditions done. They're anticipating that there'll be a second investigatory view. So when that happens, that means the regulator asks for additional information and then potentially doesn't like what it got and asks for more as it continues to determine things. And that can take a while. And so they've kind of positioned themselves for an 18-month window. That seems nice. I mean, that seems like about right if they're going to go through a long period. Their worst case scenario, I think, is you go through that period, you're sitting in limbo for a long period of time, and then the FTC says, you know what, we're just not happy with it. We're going to try to block it. Because at that point, you're going to argue against them. You're going to fight. And the FTC, I think the other part that's important here is if we got to that point in time, they aren't the final arbiters of whether or not there has been a Clayton Act violation. Right? The FTC is an executive agency. They don't decide on their own. So they bring the complaint, they ultimately bring a lawsuit, and then it goes to the judicial branch. And the FTC and the Department of Justice don't win every time. We talked about those 90s Microsoft cases. The Department of Justice half won. Microsoft appealed. Microsoft half won. A settlement was entered into. It didn't quite go through all the way. Everybody half won. Almost everybody lose. So, I mean, it's one of those things where when you talk about this, it's easy to say the FTC might do something. And if they did, it would be bad. Right? We see from, for instance, NVIDIA getting blocked on their deal to purchase ARM by the FTC has leaked out. It would seem that they're probably not going to pursue it because it's too difficult. You're paying lawyers to fight this thing. You might not be overly sold on what it was anyway. You might have buyer's remorse.
Sorry, just for clarity there, the FTC basically told NVIDIA, no way. And NVIDIA said, this is too expensive to fight. We're just going to let it go.
Yeah, that's where they've hinted they're at. We're all kind of living in rumor land right now. But that deal was for microchip designs.
Yeah.
And so there were national security concerns. There were other concerns that the U.S. government had in that. That was clearly what I would put, if we were ranking these, significantly higher level than video games and video game content.
Well, you're talking about things that can program any mechanical device, basically. That's dangerous, right? So
dangerous and cutting off all competition puts all this control over that specific sensitive area.
Like,
so that's what they were worried about.
Yeah, so like I have to imagine they're thinking, well, if NVIDIA can make all these semiconductors and they're like the only one that can do it while there's a shortage, they're going to have like a huge advantage over anybody else, right?
Right. And they go into, Warcraft and things like that. Shouldn't have used that term. I'm talking about fighter planes, not the Blizzard series. And so that's what you're worried about when you're having those kinds of conversations. And NVIDIA tried to get around them. You can actually see their defense documents and say, hey, look, we'll promise we're going to be neutral. We're not going to cut off these other people for their CPU processes. We're going to do all these things. And the FTC is still saying, it's not good enough. We don't trust you, essentially.
Yeah, so the FTC basically said, you could end up being like Tony Stark for real, and we're not cool with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know I'm not as sold on the rumors that NVIDIA is just going to drop it. They might come swinging back around for it. But certainly, that's the kind of thing that you're more worried about. If you're Microsoft, you're putting all this investment you did for the last 3 months, right? The amount of due diligence, the amount of efforting to actually get to a closing document is significant in and of itself. And then you're going to be waiting for a long period of time. You're not necessarily going to finalize what your structure is internally, who's going to report to whom, whether or not you're going to hire the additional people that are going to be needed to manage these various things, what that looks like. You're going to be in limbo until this thing actually closes. In significant regards, that hurts you as it happens. And then if they ultimately decide to cause trouble, that's in my opinion, your worst case scenario.
So worst case, it ends up in the courts.
Worst case if Microsoft decides to pursue it. I mean, the worst case is depending on what perspective you have.
Yeah.
Microsoft drops it, and then what the heck happens to Activision? Right? Activision's also in limbo during all this.
Yeah.
They had a cratering stock price. I mean, are they just obliterated if this deal doesn't go through?
Well, if it doesn't go through, Activision's gone, right? And they're just going to piecemeal out the IPs. Like that's what would happen, right? We've seen it happen before. That's what happened to who was it not that long ago? I can't remember their name, but it happened to a company like they were in Canada or something. All right, I can blank it on the name. I'm sorry, but a bunch of IPs ended up just sort of going out into the wind.
Yeah, I mean, it does happen. You can have a fire sale kind of situation. You could have an immediate turnover of the board and the management that could try to save it. I mean, the assets of Activision are still strong. I mean, we could see that. The biggest issue with their stock price in 2021 were cultural issues. And so if you could fix those very quickly, you might be able to bounce back. But certainly a deal falling through has everybody's stock take a dive because all the investors were anticipating and buying stock based on it actually happening. Yeah. So that's your worst case, is essentially a long delay and then bad legal action. I think that's unlikely. I think outside of what we can see on the outside, Microsoft will be talking with the FTC. We'll be having conversations about what they need and whether they're sensitive to certain aspects of the deal, and they'll be working through it. They have a lot of lawyers to look at this stuff.
I think I was thinking about 38 Studios. I'd have to come back to that remark, though. Sorry. I know something like that has happened before, and I personally, I don't know.
The last fire sale that I think of in big regards is THQ. You know, they wound up selling their whole name out, and then the various IPs, and then you saw THQ revived. But that's a name. I mean, that's the thing that I always talk to people about when, you know, Toys R Us gets moved. Toys R Us is back. Well, yeah, I mean, somebody bought the name. It's not the same entity that you used to buy from, but it's fine.
So the other big acquisition in the markets right now, and I'm curious, I assume the FTC and DOJ are also going to look at the Bungie purchase because it's over the, what is it, $100 million threshold?
It's 92, I think, right now, but I call it 100 for people to think about, because 100 million, obviously 70 billion passes that, 3 billion passes that too. So yeah, we're talking
substantial,
about,
but obviously not a $70 billion. So like, what sort of stuff are they even going to look at there? Because to me, that just seems like a done deal. Like,
yeah, well, so it's automatic. So you submit your paperwork, and then if they don't need a second view, essentially. U.S. regulators don't approve deals. They essentially just allow them. They don't try to stop them. There's a timing window. They'll look at it. And if they don't do anything for 30 days, you can move forward with your deal on a regulatory basis in the United States. They're going to look at it. They might give it a second look, even just to evidence fairness, right? You have these two market competitors, and just to make it as fair looking as possible. Again, very political process here, and I don't mean that as a negative. It's just the nature of the beast. And so they might give it a second look, but ultimately, they are quantifiably different transactions, right? When you're talking about Bungie purchasing, Sony purchasing Bungie, you're talking fundamentally right this second about a developer more than a publisher that makes a game. And that's distinguished from 3 gigantic companies that make a whole lot of games that are very, very successful in multiple markets. And so that's evident in and of itself from the price tag. But that's when they're evaluating these kinds of things, it's what's your market concentration? How are you moving it? What power do you accrue? And Sony, I think for all the world really, looks like they purchased Bungie as essentially a stopgap safeguard against losing access to Call of Duty, particularly on their service side, whatever their subscription service winds up looking. And then everything that they've explained to both their investors and in their press release about essentially institutional know-how, technological expertise for live services games makes sense. Sony didn't have that expertise. And that's much the same reason why I don't think Microsoft will get in trouble on the King side, right? Microsoft doesn't have a ton of presence in fantastically successful revenue-generating mobile games. And so buying King essentially gives them that first foothold. It's a gigantic foothold. King is.
I'm surprised, like nobody talked about King, and I'm just like, you're all talking about Call of Duty. You know, King dwarfs Call of Duty in terms of revenue.
People don't know that. People don't know that.
Look at the numbers, you know. Yeah.
You go and you look at the King portion of the revenue, and it's the biggest section of A, B, and K. But people don't think about it that way. And people, I think that in our neck of the woods, that are talking about the console games and the stuff that we grew up on, and that kind of box under the TV framework. don't understand the revenue out there in mobile gaming. And that's why you see pushes there. And that's why you see Microsoft want to get in. That's why you see Take-Two buy Zynga, which nobody's talking about, which was the biggest deal in gaming history for about 6 minutes.
It's boring though. It's Farmville.
Yeah.
We don't care about Farmville and
it is boring. I can
and
tell
all the
you,
data collection that's happening, you know.
I can tell you from virtual legality, right? I did a video on Zynga, I did a video on Activision, I did a video on Bungie, and you know darn well which was the worst received.
Yeah.
Right? The Zynga deal is very interesting. It's a platform that is being added to a console publisher, but people did not care.
Yeah. It's just silly to sort of think about, because you think in terms of revenue, like who's the biggest earner, and it's King, and nobody cares.
Candy Crush.
Yeah.
Well, you look at that, the same reason Sony buys Bungie as they deliver to the public. Microsoft has to be champing at the bit to get institutional know-how of how to use monetization strategies. How do you keep a game like Candy Crush at the top of the lists for forever? Right? I mean, it's a simple game. How are they doing that? That knowledge of those folks is so useful to a company that has all this other IP that could potentially go and enter into that market.
Sony's purchase of Bungie is like one of the smartest things they ever did. I'm happy because my favorite game, Destiny, is going to remain cross-platform. Like I never would want to go back to how it was during Destiny 1, where I had to play on 2 different consoles, you know, like, and just have a character to be able to experience or play with those players. Like that's just an old way of doing things. So I think it's really smart of Sony to leave that one cross-platform. And the next Bungie one will be cross-platform. I am surprised that the deal like is going through like that. But when you realize that, and I've been criticized for saying this, that Sony's goal is to make 10 Destiny-like games, it's smart. Look at how many people have tried and failed to do it. Anthem, EA backed Anthem, crashed and burned, right?
It did.
And here Sony purchased Bungie because Bungie is the best in the business at making games like this, right? You could argue maybe the Warframe developer would be a close second in my personal opinion. But
I usually think of Epic. I usually think of Epic as best in the business of maintaining a live services game. They obviously have a resource advantage. They have a resource advantage over everybody. But I think they've done a good job of keeping Fortnite alive. And I say that as somebody who, Tim Sweeney yells at me all the time because I covered Epic versus Apple. But Fortnite I think is a very good live services package. I have Epic and Bungie tied at the top there. But yeah, I think it's a good deal. It's interesting. I will tell you this, as a lawyer, I would never, ever have recommended signing onto a deal with those creative control terms that Bungie has described, that Sony has gone out there to its investors with. As a Bungie fan, it makes total sense to be stoked for that.
Yeah.
But as a person that's spending $4 billion, I say you cannot possibly give final publishing rights and creative control and everything else that Bungie is claiming that they've gotten, because you don't manage that ship. And Bungie is historically, famously prickly with its ownership and dealing with creative differences and things like that. So I don't know how this is going to look down the line for that aspect of it, their creation of their own IP. But clearly it was a Bungie non-starter type term.
Yeah.
We're not going to enter into a deal if you don't give us this. And Sony said, okay.
From a business perspective, I don't understand it. I don't understand how you allow the cross-platform thing to continue. From a gamer perspective, I'm like, this is great. I don't have to screw up my Destiny account again,
Well, I'm all for it being multi-platform. I mean, I think you are going to see Call of Duty be multi-platform, because I think there's...
Wouldn't it be sort of silly to like lock it on one play? Like, I get the long-term play of like converting people to Xbox users, but like... We had this, I feel like it's just like a resurfacing of the Minecraft conversation, right? They left Minecraft multi-plat.
Certainly the historical ones, right? Like Destiny 2, I would never have expected to be pulled back. If this was just announced, I don't think Destiny 2 was ever going to get pulled back. The next game is an interesting announcement, but I think if you are interested in having multiplayer-based, microtransaction full type game, then engagement is your metric, and you want more of that engagement. You don't necessarily care where it comes from. What surprises me is Sony essentially being described as not having final say in those kinds of questions, right? It doesn't bother me one bit if Sony says Destiny should stay where it is, it should stay multi-platform, we should support it multi-platform. That makes total sense. Just like I think it makes total sense for Call of Duty to continue to be multi-platform, because it's that kind of pinnacle tentpole game, gets your game studio's name in other places. It's sold for money instead of being on your Game Pass. You can market it that way. All sorts of great things, I think, from being multi-platform in a game like that.
Yeah.
But I still want to be the one that decides it. If I'm Phil, I'm the one that wants to decide it. If I'm Jim Ryan, I'm the one that wants to decide it. And I look at that deal and I say, in all honesty, Microsoft, I can't imagine would ever enter into a deal where they give up all control provisions to the company they just purchased. Independent subsidiary is not a real legal term. That's not a thing. So it's very interesting to see that. And independence, I think, appears 7 times in the first press release. It might be 9. It's a huge number of times, clearly important to Bungie. And I, corporate lawyer me, would have said, you better be making off with the kitchen sink and some synergies with live services or otherwise, because this has a real chance of rubbing you the wrong way in the medium term.
Well, what I imagine, like, I'm just going to put on my pretend cap for a second, I'll call it. What I imagine they're like, sure, you can have Destiny, you can have your next game, you can have the game after that, but we want the Resistance version of Destiny. We want the SOCOM version of Destiny that's bringing in millions and millions of dollars every month from our users who want these type of properties, right? So time's just going to tell about how it plays out. It's not happening anytime soon. We won't see anything happen for this. At minimum, like, we see a trailer in 5 years, I would guess.
5 years?
I don't know. What do you think?
Sony promised those 10 games before 2026, I believe.
All right. Well, I'll believe it when I see it, I guess.
No, some will be delayed undoubtedly, but that was an investor statement. You can, like I tell people in virtual legality, you can always take investor statements a little bit further than statement to, Game Industry Biz or IGN or whomever, because the ones that are directly investor facing have to be even more closely vetted. So that 10 live services games comes from their speech on their financial records. So there will be delays.
I like that 10. Like, if it was like 2 or 3. That's cool.
Well, imagine that they're different scales, right? I mean, it could be it could be like a 3v3 shooter thing that's going to have a live service element that they want to work. It could be a Destiny. I mean, there's all sorts of different versions of live services, right? So they could be trying to get into mobile more. Who knows?
I didn't think of that. Yeah, Sony's going to have some cool stuff in the next few years. That's for sure. What else did I have? I had one more for you.
Sure. I love talking about major acquisitions in gaming. It's not like I've got a shortage of them.
Yeah. So let's hypothetically play it the other way. Deal goes through, no problem for Microsoft. Yeah. Do they keep buying, or do they sort of slow their roll a little bit?
At some point, I think, just practically speaking, they're going to have to make sure that their boats are all rowing in the same direction. This is a major shift in what the size and scope of Xbox Game Studios is. Right. And now it's Microsoft Gaming, I suppose. They changed the name. They're doing reorganizations. That's going to mean more management. They're going to have to figure out exactly how to control those things. They're going to have to figure out what their philosophy is for all the ZeniMax companies and all the Activision companies, how heavy of a hand to take, what creative control you want. Phil has said he wants to have a light hand, but that works as long as people are putting out products that are good. That works as long as everything is going the way you want it to go. And one of these developers, I feel confident in saying, it's going to wind up a problem child. It's going to run into issues, going to have a heavier hand put on it. And so part of this is the actual snake eating the giant animal in the jungle, right? You have to figure out how to digest that. So Microsoft is going to have to go through those steps at some point, but I can guarantee you, if they see a good deal, they're going to go for it. If the Activision, I think, wasn't in their plans originally, and then they had a 35% stock price drop over a month. And then they said, well, if we can buy it at what amounts to a non-premium, it's technically 45% over what the price was when they announced it, but it led to the same price or less than the maximum price that they were at before all the stuff with California.
So it's probably
Microsoft is going to look at.
So hypothetically, just mathematically, that's like 110 billion dropped down to 70 billion, something like that.
Something like that. Yeah, north of 100 billion. No, that's right. That's right. Because their top line price in I want to say like March was $105, $110 a share. Microsoft is buying them for $95 a share, and they were buying them at a $95 price when I think the share price was in the low 60s. So if you imagine that California doesn't happen, the markets were valuing the assets of Activision, even though they aren't at full power. Call of Duty Vanguard isn't full power. World of Warcraft isn't full power for what it has historically been. Even then, $100 a share, Microsoft bought them for less than what the market was selling them for in the same calendar year, give or take. that was the offering. So Microsoft looks at this and says, we got a steal. This is a very, very good price for the Activision assets. Most of the problems in the Activision market price were for cultural reasons, and that is cleansed by moving over to a new boss. Right? In general, that's cleansed automatically. We're gonna fix all of this.
Time will tell. And that's such a serious topic. Like, I think time's going to tell on that. I think kicking Bobby Kotick out is going to be one of the key things that signals to the employees that we see what's going on. We want to fix this. But I certainly hope that the working conditions drastically improve for the employees of Activision Blizzard.
Course. Yeah. No, and I think we're in violent agreement here that we want our games to be made in conditions that are fantastic for the developers and as good as they can possibly be. I think Microsoft looks at this and says all of those problems are cultural, all of those problems are management structural. Those are going to get wiped anyway in a merger. You're not going to have two levels of management controlling this thing. And so it made a lot of sense for that deal. Now, I think you even see Phil Spencer out there going, this is the biggest thing I've ever done. This is a gargantuan acquisition. This is the biggest thing in gaming history. And I do think if I'm sitting there advising Microsoft, if they're asking me this question instead of you, I say, we want to make sure that everything runs properly when we get all these studios up, right? It's 34 developers, I think, after the acquisition purchase. So I would want a short period of time where we're making sure this is all working, because Microsoft's been on a buying spree for 3 years. Very little of that has come out of that process yet. I mean, game development takes time. So outside of a couple of things, I think Psychonauts 2 to me stands as their best success. Yeah.
And
that was being made by Double Fine substantially before the acquisition. They were crowdfunded. They used Fig and things like that.
Even Starfield and Redfall, same situation. Those are this year, but those were in development before the purchase.
But I think you can see, if we want to be generous to Microsoft, Psychonauts 2, I think, is very clearly the most well-resourced game that Tim Schafer and Double Fine have ever released. It feels smoother. It feels like money was thrown at it. It feels like it had that polish pass. So in my mind, if I'm an optimist, and I am, you're looking at a situation where Phil can take that light hand. If Microsoft can have that creative control stay with the new subsidiaries and just pour money into them, and it makes sense, it gives ROI to everybody involved, then that's great. You're getting really fancy, really polished Double Fine games instead of the little bit janky, half works Double Fine games. And you can see that kind of same thing with Obsidian, hopefully, and all their games that they're working on, and everybody else. I think Ninja Theory is getting better resources than they would in other instances. So I can see it working, but to me, Microsoft still has to put the proof out there.
Yeah.
We're still in a place where they bought all these companies, but we haven't seen their new pipelines work. Certainly not as effectively as Sony, even though they're more focused right now, but their pipelines clearly function very, very well.
Yeah, we got Forza Horizon 5. It launched 10 million players. I corrected it in the comments, but I got called out on that one.
Love Horizon 5.
Yeah, great game. And then Halo launched really, really strong. Pretty decent campaign. Some weird storytelling stuff, in my opinion. Strong multiplayer, but multiplayer has dropped off significantly, right? So what's the next big thing from Microsoft, and will it hold up to, I would say, the polish of Forza Horizon 5, which I adored, So
yeah, Horizon 5, and it's like Playground has figured that out. I mean, it's very funny. Horizon 5 got all these kudos and Game of the Year potential nominations, and I look at it and I say, I love Horizon 5. To me, it's Horizon.
Yeah.
I get it every couple of years, and it's great every single time. I love Horizon 4. I love Horizon 5. I didn't see the sea change that some people did, but I still love it to death.
Well, I mean, I'll just go into that really quick. I played 4 a bit, right? And I played it with friends and everything, but there was something about 5 where I could not stop playing it. Like, I would turn it on, and I would just be doing the jump tricks, or racing against the ghost, or doing the battle royale mode, or whatever in it. I played through the whole campaign. I was constantly trying to it just had its hooks in me in a way that Forza Horizon 4 didn't. I think 4, by the end of it, once all the content expansions and such were added, I think it was in a really, really good place. But yeah, man, I really, really adored 5. Halo is part of the reason that I'm actually in the industry, right? Back when it was owned by Bungie, I did a video about Halo 3 and won a contest, and then that was however many years ago Halo 3 came out. Yeah, so Halo is one of my favorite franchises, and Bungie is one of my favorite developers. I think it's awesome, the deal that they were able to get with Sony. I'm glad that the game, the Destiny game, which I adore, frustrating sometimes, but I definitely have been covering that for like a decade. So I'm excited about it. And I'm really excited to hear that Bungie is going to be helping Sony make cool stuff. Like, I'm really, really hopeful and excited about where that's going. I think Sony has a really, really good strategy. And I'm just really excited about 2022, 2023, because both of these companies are in a place. I feel like I just went on a weird tangent, but both of these companies are in a place where they're positioned to make amazing games. And that's why I'm just excited about where we're at. Mergers and everything included. I don't care that Sony's buying all the companies. I don't care that Microsoft's buying the companies either. I think both are going to make great stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. And that's, people ask me that question all the time, is consolidation. Are you worried about these kinds of things? And in general, in tech, I don't worry about consolidation too much. Competitors always rise up. People leave. Infinity Ward felt they got mistreated. Respawn develops, goes to EA. EA has a competitor. I mean, these things just happen. And so I think that's going to continue to happen. And what I tell people is I'm very happy that after 20 years, Microsoft has said this is an industry we want to be invested in, involved in even more. And they've spent $70 billion. They're going to have to go chase that. They're going to have to go make content that you value, or at least somebody in the market values. I know people are worried that it's going to be something that they don't want. That's the way markets work. There's a lot of games that are made that aren't what I would prefer. If everybody were making single-player role-playing games, I'd be thrilled. But that's not what always makes the money. So I think that having Microsoft expend that pressure, get fully invested, make Sony better, might make Nintendo better. Nintendo's always off in its own corner, doing its own thing, doing it well, making a ton of money. But overall, make things better. And for the folks that are worried about these things, could it go wrong? Of course. Lots of things could go wrong. But I think it's a good sign that there are big players that see our industry and say, yeah, that's something we want to pour money into.
One thing, and I don't know if they said this specifically, this will be my last question for you, but this has been so great. I feel like I learned so much. Thank you for, coming on the show.
Oh, it's just fun. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's fun to talk to you about stuff. The question I have though is, the idea that Microsoft is always saying, well, look at Tencent, look at Apple, look at all these other companies. Is there any substance to that worry, or do you feel like that's a deflection?
So it's a couple of things, I think. I think it's legitimate. I mean, I think you've got big tech companies with even better cash positions than Microsoft that could easily get into this by purchasing companies. For the most part right now, Google's tried to do its own thing internally. Amazon's tried to do its own thing internally. These are companies that could invest at the Microsoft kind of level. It is, however, a bit of a deflection. I think one of the things that everybody should be keeping in mind is right now the regulators in both the United States and other jurisdictions are looking at them. This is the point in time where the spotlight is going to be on them the brightest for the next year, let's say. And so everything coming out of Microsoft, everything from Phil, everything from Satya is in part, here's why you shouldn't do anything to this deal. Right? You have Satya coming out and say, I don't think they'll do anything. This is a perfectly clean deal. Yeah. And that's what a CEO should say. But you also have comments that say, well, we're not even, Sony and Nintendo and us, we're all in the same team. We're gamers and we're not worried about them. It's all good. What you should be worrying about is Apple and Google and Tencent and all these. Because why? Because politically, Washington, the one thing Republicans and Democrats can agree on today is that they hate big tech. That presents a thing that is unifying. So Microsoft, one of their messaging strategies, I think it's already been revealed, is don't think about it as gaming even. Think about it as technology. Think about it as entertainment. And do you want Tencent or Apple or Google to get these assets? No, of course you don't. We're Microsoft. We're the good guys. Yeah. And that's what you'll see as those statements. So it's deflection, but it's also accurate. Tencent or Apple or Google could easily just go buy Electronic Arts and be a publisher now.
Apple's all our phones. They also are in the gaming industry. Google's all our browsers and search engines, and they're failing at the game industry, right? And then Tencent's WeChat, right, which is a huge chat platform that maybe not a lot of
video game companies. They're 40% plus of Epic, so that's 40% plus of Fortnite.
I'm very aware they have a lot of investments across the industry, but I'm curious what they're going to do with it going forward. So. Yeah,
it's unclear. Tencent is legitimately, part of a Chinese government ownership block for these kinds of things. So you never know what's going to happen with those. I think some people a little too worried about that, but it's still worth noting that that's their affiliation. So they're not acting in the same way as a purely profit-driven acquirer would be. So they're kind of a wild card out there, and I think it's always worth paying attention to those kinds of things. And certainly, it's worth paying attention to if you're Microsoft to say, look at those evil guys that would gobble up these assets.
Mm-hmm.
We're not evil. We're Microsoft. Good American success story. And I think that's the direction they will continue to go. Whether you believe it or not, that's good messaging. It's a wise strategy.
American success story. Let's not talk about the 80s, 90s, right?
But out of a garage, I mean, it's Microsoft has pitched that for forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it is what it is. And I think it'll go through. I don't think they're going to require drastic changes. There might be some divestitures or covenants or things. But at the end of the day, I think they can tell a good story that says we're just a big fish with other big fish. And you shouldn't just be looking at this as gaming. And Sony's the primary party that would complain. And they're a smaller market capitalization Japanese company with less of an American footprint.
Has Sony
that's the honest to God truth.
Sony hasn't really complained though, right?
No. Sony is the party that would be most likely to complain.
But they
the
haven't,
FTC
actually. So like in the gamer sphere, like a lot of Sony fans seem very concerned about the merger, but Sony themselves, basically their only comment was, well, you better keep making Call of Duty cross-platform. And that was it.
Well, I will tell you, if they were going to fight a fight on this, it wouldn't be in the public sphere.
It'd be in the court.
So part of the not in court necessarily. Part of the FTC investigative process will be to talk to market participants.
Mm-hmm.
And most prominently, that'd be Sony. And so that'll be part of the review of the acquisition. And so if they wanted to cause trouble, it would be in that kind of context. But I don't know. I don't claim to even pretend to deign to know what is happening in the closed door boardroom sessions of Sony or Microsoft. But they're the most obvious market participant that would have the biggest concern about Call of Duty being closed off to them or other Activision properties. That's what you're looking at. No, not at all.
If you're Microsoft, you're not popping champagne and celebrating until the deal's closed, right? You wait.
Yeah, no, the closing is when you have the fancy closing dinners with the $10,000 restaurant bills. Yeah, it's not signing. Yeah. Signing day is not that day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, this has just been fascinating. There's probably a million more questions that I could think of, but I feel like I learned a lot. And it's just one of those topics where I'm like, I do not know enough about the legal stuff. Like I looked at some of the links that you had and it's like, it'd take me 2 days to read the documents. And I'm just like, I just got to ask somebody who knows what's going on.
It provides sources, right? Over in Virtual Legality, we link everything that I look at so that you can decide that I'm an idiot and you can leave that comment. And believe me, some people do.
Yeah.
And I love that. That's what it is. Reasonable disagreement is the spice of life. Reasonable minds can differ. That's what I'm all about. Now I think I'm right most of the time, or else I'm not putting my opinion out there, but I love to have those conversations. So that's what those links are for. But I totally get it. I hand you a statute that's 20 pages long. I don't blame anybody for saying, okay, Rick, we'll wait for the next one. I get it.
Yeah. People can find your stuff though over at Hoeg Law, which I will link to in the description below. And if you're like me, you can call it Hoeg. You seem to get it, but don't.
If it helps you remember how to spell it, I will take it. Absolutely.
Yeah. Hoeg. I remember that. Did I get it?
You got it.
Nailed it. Well, thank you so much.
Letters.
This has been awesome. Go subscribe to his stuff because honestly, your content is great. Every time I watch it, I feel like I learned something about the legal system and like what all this stuff means for the gaming space. So it's linked in the description. I'll put it in the pinned comment. Thank you for stopping by. Of course, if you want to check out my stuff, you can hit subscribe. Anything else you want to plug? Any cool video that you just did recently or anything?
No, I mean, we just did some Bungie stuff. We just did some Microsoft stuff. Analyzed Satya Nadella's comments that were made to Financial Times this weekend. Reading between the lines a little bit, some of the defenses they're going to be pulling up, exactly how they're responding to questions like you asked me about whether regulators would get involved. Not anything on its face that is at all surprising, but some interesting stuff in there. And yeah, I think the channel's basically been taken over by acquisitions for the last month. So our Microsoft times Activision playlist is 10 videos, a lot of different angles there. And Bungie, I think we've done 4 or 5 videos on it at this point in time. So yeah, a lot of great stuff. I think if you're interested in this conversation, you clicked on this video, a lot of good stuff for you over in Virtual Legality if you're interested.
Awesome. Well, my son's telling me it's time's up for this video. Thank you so much. Real quick shout out. Thank you to all the members. My video's not set up for it, but thank you to them. I'm going to get out of here. Thank you. Hoeg Law. Check out his stuff. Let's get out of here. See you next time.
Sounds good.